All right, that brings us to our speaker of the day. Bob Schmidt is going to talk about a topic from Selma to Montgomery. Bob, welcome.
Paul stole my opening line. I was going to say to you that you have to be careful about what you say around these tables when Tom Bound is sitting next to you. He went to Paul, and I finally had to give up. The pressure was relentless. I was thinking too. This really is like speaking to preaching to a Presbyterian church. You know, all the front pews are open here, which is so typical. It was 48 years ago in March this year. There was a march in Alabama from Selma to Montgomery, and I'm sure we've all heard about it. The town of Selma is 54 miles east of Montgomery. West of Montgomery. There had been a voter registration drive going on there, and you know, some of the statistics I didn't realize. That I'm not sure I ever realized them. The town of Selma is 57% black. There were 15,000 possible voters in that town, and of 15,000 blacks who were possible voters in that town, and only 130 of them were registered. And this drive went on for, I think, a couple of years, and eventually it started out through a local voter registration drive, as well as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And as a result, they increased that 130 registered numbers to 300. And so, and that was when Martin Luther King had come in and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So in March, the decision was a painful decision that they were going to attempt this march from Selma to Montgomery. And it's known as Bloody Sunday because, you know, there are about 600 people. You've all seen the pictures. They crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the sheriff of the county, I think his name is Jim Clark, had met them with force, and it was a bloody scene. There were beatings. There was a lot of violence there. Clark, I didn't know this, had that day ordered all white males over 21 to come in to be, and these are white males, understand, to be sworn in as deputy sheriffs under his leadership. That was Sunday, March 7th. Tuesday, March 9th, there was another call. It was a turnaround Sunday. It was planned, at least among the leadership, for political reasons. They crossed the bridge and were turned back, and they turned back peacefully. And so Martin Luther King Jr. Agreed to a third march, and this was allowed because I guess a judge who was fairly sympathetic to the cause down there, one of the few, provided an injunction, and so some 2,000 people set out on Sunday, March 21st, guarded by the Army, the National Guard that was federalized at that point, and for 4 days they walked from the 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, to the outskirts of Montgomery. And then on the 25th, I read two different articles. One said 25,000 people, another said 50,000 people. You take your choice, I don't know, from across the country, gathered in on the edge of Montgomery and accompanied the march into the state capitol in the center. And I was one of those 25 or 50,000 people. How did this happen in my life? I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the 1940s and the 50s, pretty bucolic place. It certainly was not a diversified community, at least in my experience. I lived on the far west side. And so the journey from my growing up to Montgomery, Alabama is quite different. I went to West High School, and at that point, junior and senior high, 7th to 12th grade, were all there. Some 2,000 of us in that building, and there were a few blacks. I can remember one Jewish family in that entire school, and I checked with others, and nobody seems to know any more than that. One Jewish family out of all these 2,000 kids. And it's interesting, I compare notes with Dick Cohen, who grew up in Norristown, who is, we're the same age. We used to play squash together, so we used to talk a lot, going and coming. And the difference in his growing up, he experienced prejudice against himself as a Jew. He knew that, and he knew the limits in Norristown. And I was oblivious to any of this stuff going on anywhere in the country. And I don't think it was because I'm completely oblivious. I just don't think there was that much happening by way, because there wasn't that much racial diversity around us when I grew up. So my education was, of course, at Ohio State, where I learned, first off, that Columbus was not the center of the universe. And for those of you who may be wondering, Happy Valley isn't either the center of the universe. And went on to Princeton Seminary, and in the process, I began to grow and see the relationship between my faith and what was going on in the world around us. I'm part of the Reformed tradition of the Protestant Reformation. And one of their fundamental beliefs is very strongly that what we believe, the content of our faith has a great deal to say about those things, especially injustice that goes on around us in our community. And my personal faith is that Jesus is my Lord and Savior. And if you read the 4 gospel accounts, you can see that Jesus had a great deal of concern about people who were held down, oppressed, kept under someone else's thumb for whatever reasons. And it's an interesting read to know that he was very concerned about these things. Today, coming from Columbus, Ohio, in my neighborhood, there's an Irish family that came from Ireland themselves. There's an Indian Buddhist family down the street, and there's a lesbian couple also in this group. So you can see this is the transformation that has gone on in my life all this time. These things would not have occurred on North Huron Avenue in Columbus, Ohio, when I was growing up. Well, I found myself in March 1965 doing some graduate work at Princeton Seminary, and we didn't have we didn't have telephones to carry around with us and with screens on them. There were very few television sets. In the student center there was one, and there were a few others, but we knew what was going on because the evening of that second march on March 9th, a man named James Reeb was brutally beaten and killed by the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. He was a graduate of Princeton Seminary, and you'll see a plaque in the Student Center today memorializing him. He was a civil rights worker down there. He started out as a Presbyterian minister, became Unitarian somewhere along the line, but he was a graduate of Princeton Seminary. So we were very much aware of what was going on, and as And then it became very obvious that people were going from all over the country to take part in this march. And there were various civil rights organizations sponsoring trains to Montgomery, Alabama. So a group of us, I guess it was maybe 10 or so of us, signed on. And on, let's see, it would be March 24th, we had to get ourselves down to Union Station in Washington, D.C., where we boarded the train. We rode overnight to Montgomery, Alabama, to a siding someplace, I guess. It was close to wherever the final encampment for this march was, and we were to join up together. And some 25 or 50,000, depending on what you read. So we rode overnight, got there, took part in the march, which was through the streets of Montgomery. And I can remember, there are a lot of things, details I don't remember anymore, but you know, the houses and the front porches were close to the street, and it was obvious what, you know, if we were in a friendly neighborhood or not. But there was no problem. And we got down there in this huge mass of people out in front of the state capitol, and we heard Martin Luther King's speech, and I guess there were other speeches. You know, there were certainly a lot of dignitaries involved in all of this, and I just don't remember a whole lot about that. But we stood there. I think we were pretty far back in the group. We were not close to what was going on, and then Martin Luther King, I guess, had a petition of some sort that he wanted to present to Governor Wallace, and he knocked on the State House door, and was told Wallace wasn't there. He was probably looking through a window someplace, watching all the proceedings. And I guess they persisted until finally a secretary came out and received the petition. And so we were to go back then to the train station in Montgomery, and I don't have any idea anymore about distances. But when we got back there, some of the more interesting things happened. It was there that I probably made one of the dumber decisions that I've ever made in my life, and I'll tell you about that one. We got back to the train station, and wouldn't you know, all the water had been cut off in the train station, so there was no drinking fountain. We'd been, out in the sun all day, and there were no restrooms, and they were locked, as a matter of fact. And I think there was a restaurant of some kind there, and of course that was closed up, locked. So we were faced with, riding the train back to Washington without any food, or presumably we'd have restrooms when we got on the train. And the train wasn't due for, I think it was about 3 hours, because I guess there were a number of trains that they had to process. So word came to us that there was a restaurant open. I seem to remember it was about 5 blocks away. And Dean, I can't think of his last name all of a sudden. Anyway, he was a student at the seminary, was in our group. Was about, 12, 15 years older than I was, had been a lawyer and had come back to seminary. And he and I decided that we were going to go to this restaurant and see if we can buy some food for our group. And so we set out. And like I say, it was probably a very dumb decision. I recognize in retrospect now. We got out there, and it was an eerie feeling in Montgomery. There was nothing. There was no one stirring. Houses were closed up tight. There was no traffic. There was nothing out there. We assumed people knew we were out there from inside the houses, but there was just nothing. And we did find our way to the restaurant. We were, we could have been accosted by some segregationist group, I guess, but we were not. We did manage to get some food. we went for our group, and we went back and got on the train. And made it back safely, obviously. There was no problem in all of that, but it could have been a dangerous situation. Later on, before we left, we were told that this restaurant was closed up by the city police, just because they were open for no other reason. So we were lucky we got some food, but it was closed up. And so we were fortunate to have what little food we were able to get for our group. And then on the train back, the word came through that Viola Liuzzo had been shot. She was from Detroit, I seem to remember, was transporting people who were participants in the march from Montgomery back to Selma. And she was shot in her car. And, and there were, of course, this was not unusual down there in those days because lots of people were beaten up or shot. And, some of those convictions came only 40 years later or so. But so we rode back to Washington that night, overnight again, with the blinds pulled on all the cars. And there was, and also I neglected to tell you that the dining car was taken off the train too. We knew that ahead of time. So we were not going to have food at all overnight. And, but anyway, we arrived safely back to Washington and back to Princeton. So that's basically my story. This, if you find it boring, why, you can blame Tom Bound, please. Talk to him about that. I don't profess to believe that a good march is going to solve everything, but it seemed like at that point, people being raised to awareness about the conditions in the South that most of us really didn't know about or appreciate. It just seemed like this was a momentous occasion. The Civil Rights Act had been passed earlier, I think early that year. So, legally these voter registration drives should have no problem, but they were harassed unbelievably by violence and by literacy tests and a lot of other things, intimidation of all kinds. And that should not have happened. But as a result, Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at that time, went before Congress, and the result was that the Voting Rights Act was passed, and it was the beginning of a lot of change in the South. And I don't pretend for a minute to suggest that only the South had problems. Obviously, we have had problems. If you saw the movie 42, which Sally and I did earlier this week, you know that in Philadelphia, there were a lot of racial problems that were not resolved even when Jackie Robinson was coming up in the major leagues. So I don't pretend to believe that we've solved everything, but for once in my life, maybe the only time that'll ever happen, it seems to me that I was part of a movement that, and believe me, it was a bit part. I was just a walk-on. But I had a part in a movement that somehow changed things for the better in this country, and I'm proud to have been part of that and to have been there. I know it's no cure for racism. That comes, that just happens and continues to happen, and it has to be dealt with in different ways. But I'm proud to have been part of that movement. I said to Jim Williams, that's the reason for this camera here, incidentally, it's because Jim Williams couldn't be here, and he wanted to hear what I had to say, and so he arranged to have this. So now watch Channel 6 tonight, or one of the major channels. channels will all be on there. But I said, you know, my role was very much a walk-on part, and he said, but the important part was that you were there. And indeed I was. So anyway, that's my story. I don't know whether you have any questions or disagreements or discussions. I'm open for whatever you have.
What year was it?
1965.
And to piggyback on what Brett's saying, you know, you're talking about 69. I was one of those Southern kids that were raised with that all the time. So my class, my junior high school, was the first junior high school to integrate in Norfolk, Virginia. And we had to go through National Guard for 3 days to get into school. And my husband's up here, same here, he couldn't believe it. He's like, you mean to tell me that you're in middle school and you had to do that? Absolutely. We were bused to school to integrate it, and we had to fight. The first month was really tough, but after that, you know, it changed in Norfolk, Virginia. Right. So all my relatives all went to the same high school because it was the only high school that anyone over the age of, what they say, 50 years old could go to in Norfolk. There was only one black high school. So if you lived in Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Norfolk, you all went to Booker T. So if you question anybody from the South at that age and ask them where they went to high school, they'll all tell you Booker T. Yeah. We were the first graduating class of Granby High School, which was the first time they tried putting the groups together.
Part of my growing up experience, I traveled as a child through the deep South. You know, and I saw the chain gangs, and from the road I saw the conditions under which people lived. I saw the whites-only signs. But you know, that I guess we coming from Columbus just figured that was the way things were. You know, I don't know that we approved of it or thought. I don't think we thought a whole lot about it because we passed by and it was not part of our experience. And you know, it was only later that I came to realize what other people were going through in that time and place that just has no should not have taken place at all, and yet it was ingrained for over 100 years or more, you know, since the Civil War, and it was still going on in spite of the legality of it. Great.
I don't know if you can remember. I gotta believe you had some really serious anxiety and fear, even if you wanted to do this on the way down, you know, getting prepared to go down. I gotta believe inside of you saying, geez, I think this could be really, am I coming back? Because
yeah.
I'm sure they were treating you very similar to the people, to the black people that were going and saying, you're part of that, you know, and that could have been serious.
Absolutely.
So while you wanted to be there, it had to have some really serious emotions going through you. I don't know if you can remember some of those. That would be interesting.
Yeah, you know, we were in 25 or 50,000 people. There's a certain amount of safety, and we knew that the federal government was behind this. You know, was providing protection, so that helped. And it really only began to hit when we went back to that train station. You know, and you know, you could sense some of this. But I'll tell you one experience that left a deeper mark of that sort in my mind was when I had occasion in '64 to drive through rural Louisiana and Mississippi, and I made a special point of going through Selma and before I came north, just to get a feel for it. And I didn't have a Deep South license plate on my car. And I got to tell you, it was a spooky feeling to be driving by myself through, you know, because you could feel the tension. And when Tom and I talked about this, he spoke about the tension that he felt. He was in the Army and was stationed in and around Selma someplace. Maybe you ought to get him next up here, Brett. He was stationed, you know, and he spoke about just walking downtown and feeling the tension in the air. And, you know, it obviously would be there if all this was going on and there was so much, so much going on in the voter registration efforts. But when you read about these voter registration efforts, it's incredible. People finally blacks were allowed to register, but only 2 days a week, and they had to stand outside in the hot sun practically all day. Some of them would be able finally to fill out the form that was required, and then they were rejected by the, by the voter registration board, whatever it was down there. That was the kind of thing that was happening. Of course, I knew nothing about that. I only read about it now. But my feelings, were really came to the fore when I made that drive through the South in 1964. Okay, my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was inspirational. Anything else? If not, we'll finish with a four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Let's go out and practice peace through service.